What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the Thursday, August 1st edition of the Ship My Money Show Tournament Thoughts Edition. Tournament show looking at DraftKings, large field tournaments, how I would be approaching it if the slate started right now. We have most of tonight's lineups, still missing a few, and you can see which ones we are missing by the teams that aren't checked up here at the top. But as I've been doing over the last few weeks, going to walk through position by position, stack by stack, and take a look at what I would be getting to if the slate had started right now. These are the lineups that I would have entered. I made 50 of them. These are the 50 that I'd be playing in the $15, $18, whatever it is today. Large field tournament, 50K to first on DraftKings. I think this gives an opportunity to talk about strategy, obviously answer some questions, but the show early in the day, when you're looking at a slate at 10, 11 a.m., obviously you're kind of just taking a walkthrough, an overview, and it's really difficult to have any sort of real stances as far as, what I would be playing, especially in a sport like baseball where you can kind of argue for doing anything. Like the worse something looks, you can just make the ownership argument because baseball is random as hell. So I do like doing this show, taking a look at what I'd be playing. And again, that doesn't mean that's the right answer and what you're doing is wrong. If you're doing something different, feel free to throw your questions in chat. If you are on a team or players or whatever that I'm not getting to, happy to let you know if I actively dislike them or just am not getting to them for random reasons. So like I said, going to go position by position. Obviously, if you are watching this back later between now and lock, you can see where I'm at by what is highlighted. And then I'll get into the stacks also. We do have weather concerns tonight, so keep an eye on that. 4 of the 5 games have at least some rain risk. Right now, St. Louis and Chicago probably looks the worst. None of them look terrible, but it's summer. There's rain everywhere. Do pay attention to this stuff. Don't get caught off guard if forecasts change in the next couple of hours. So starting with the pitching that I'm getting to here, I thought on the show this morning that there's kind of like really distinct tiers of pitching. Sonny Gray and Imanaga, I think, are the most talented pitchers on the slate. But then you have Charlie Morton in a great matchup. You have Seth Lugo in a great matchup. Neither of them are quite as good as Gray and Imanaga talent-wise, but they are in very good spots against the Marlins and the Tigers, respectively. And then you have like a bunch of just sort of secondary. Then you have the Rockies-Angels game where you just have, in Feltner's case, an average pitcher, in Fulmer's case, below average pitchers going up against below average offenses. And then you have every other pitcher is still like playable, just not exciting. You have a bunch of guys that are playable because it's a 5-game slate. If it were a 10-gamer, you would be ignoring like half of these pitchers. So interested to see where I'm getting there. And we can see that I'm getting to Gray the most. He is projected for a lot of ownership. He is projected to be, or I have him projected rather, to be the second highest, third highest owned pitcher. SaberSim had him the highest. I have him third highest. So 3 similar, 30 plus owned pitchers in Gray, Morton, and Lugo. Imanaga not too far behind the 26%. But Gray does have the highest strikeout percentage on the slate by a pretty decent margin at 30.5%. That's like almost 6 points higher than Imanaga, who's in second. 2.73 xFIP is about a full run better than any other pitcher on the slate. The matchup against the Cubs isn't the easiest. We don't have their specific lineup yet, but their active roster ranks 13th in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching, 102 WRC plus. I do think this implied run total has come down around a half run, if I remember correctly, since this morning. So that's good to see for Gray. But at 9,800, I like taking the talent there. You compare this salary to Imanaga, you compare it to Seth Lugo, and he's a better strikeout pitcher than both. I understand Lugo has the better matchup. I typically don't get a lot of Seth Lugo when he's expensive. And the reason is just that he's not that good of a strikeout pitcher. 21.8% K percentage this year. Now, the matchup with the Tigers does help. They rank 11th in strikeout percentage. They have an 84 WRC plus against right-handed pitching. They're in Lugo's pitching in a good park for pitching. So, I understand why Lugo is popular here, but if you're going to give me Lugo at the same ownership as Gray and for all intents and purposes, the same price point, most of the time I'm going to just take Sonny Gray because he's the more talented of the two pitchers. He is the better strikeout pitcher. And this is something I know I've said a million times in the past. There's not really such thing as a floor in MLB DFS, but the closest that you're going to get for pitching is strikeouts. It's not matchup, because if you have a pitcher that doesn't generate a lot of swings and misses, doesn't get a lot of strikeouts, even if they're playing against a bad team, it's still a major league offense. The pitcher can still just get unlucky on balls in play. And then if they do get unlucky, they do give up a few runs. They don't have that ability to make back those points by racking up strikeouts. So generally, in a situation like this, I am happy to be getting to the guy that just gets more strikeouts. And in this case, that is Sonny Gray. So I do like that. Again, there are weather concerns in this game that could change that. Seems like there's just kind of storms around, and maybe there ends up being delay, maybe there doesn't. If you are risk averse, you certainly could, lower Gray's projection, or just, tone down how much of him you are playing. That is certainly something that I may end up deciding to do between now and lock, but for now, not taking that approach. So I'm happy getting to him. I think that looks perfectly fine. Ryan Feltner, I really like. I said this morning that I thought I would get a lot of him, especially if the ownership projection didn't come up. It really hasn't. He's still projected for around 16% ownership. And I think Feltner just stands out as far as value plays go. Kidder Montero is really your other option in this like 6K or below range. He has a very tough strikeout matchup against Kansas City. He isn't anything special as far as pitching goes. I'm not going to say that Feltner is special either, but he does have a 20.5% K percentage despite pitching roughly half his games in Coors Field. He has a 4.1 xFIP. He's a more talented pitcher than 6K. And then he does get an Angels team that isn't particularly good offensively either. 92 WRC plus on the Angels active roster against right-handed pitching this year. So as long as Feltner's ownership doesn't come up, I expect to get a lot of him. If it does come up, I still think I will be getting a good amount, but just probably not as much as I am right now. There is a chance that this 16, 17% ownership is closer to like, 24, 25, just given how good he looks to me versus what the field is doing. A lot of times when something like this happens, it is an indication that ownership is just being projected too low for one reason or another. Obviously, a lot of players, especially players that are entering a lot of lineups, use Sims now. And so if something is showing up really well in my Sims-based process, there's a good chance it's going to be showing up that way for a lot of the field too. But one way or the other, I'm happy getting the Feltner here. He looks good. It's not a good park to pitch in, but again, it's still better than Colorado. Getting to Imanaga and Morton at 35% apiece. That's right around the field on Morton, a little bit over on Imanaga. Not an ideal matchup for Imanaga. He's good, but the Cardinals do have right-handed power. But Imanaga, like I alluded to before, does rank second in strikeout percentage on the slate. He has the lowest walk percentage, 3.79 xFIP. Good pitcher, and he's getting less ownership than the other pitchers in that range. Really good matchup for Morton here. The Marlins aren't the easiest team to strike out because they do tend to just be aggressive and put the ball in play. They rank 14th in K percentage against right-handed pitching this year, but they have an 89 WRC plus. They just traded most of the good hitters on their team. So Morton, I think, pretty self-explanatory. Montero only getting 8% ownership. I'm getting to about 18 or 20. I think that looks fine. I guess I should fix this so these numbers are actually right. So in the ballpark of what I was saying before, but those were my top 20 lineups, not my top 50. So Gray did come down a little bit when I adjusted that. Feltner went up a little bit. Imanaga actually passed Gray. Still have Gray ahead of Lugo. So some changes there that I just messed up. But Montero, I got to 18%, so I'm around 2x the field. I don't have any confidence in him. I don't like the matchup against KC, but he is cheap. The park is good. KC is going to be popular too. So usually when I talk about negative correlation, it's more so to do with hitters against pitchers. But on these smaller slates, it is worth keeping in mind that if Montero gives you a solid start, it does increase the chances that this very popular Kansas City offense isn't doing what people wanted, and that is going to help you out a bit as well. Seth Lugo, I think is going over owned. I alluded to it when I was talking about Gray, but it is a good matchup against the Tigers. But nothing about Seth Lugo is a $9,400 pitcher, except for he's facing the Tigers in Detroit. So I think this good matchup is baked into the salary, but then the field is still just flocking to it because it's a quote unquote safe matchup against the Tigers. Similar implied run total to Gray against the Cubs. Not that far off. Imanaga against the Cards, similar to Morton against Miami. But Lugo is, to me, kind of the odd guy out there because he's more expensive than Morton, who is the pitcher with a comparable matchup. And Morton has better strikeout stuff too. He's similarly priced to Gray and Imanaga, who, yeah, their matchup is worse, but not that much worse. And they are both much better strikeout pitchers. If Lugo were like, 20% owned, and you were talking about 35% to Imanaga and 45% or something like that to Gray, I would really like probably getting to Lugo and just saying, the range of outcomes is pretty close, even if his strikeout stuff isn't as good. But if his ownership is going to be higher than Imanaga and about the same as Gray and similar to Morton, even though Morton's cheaper, Lugo is the guy that I would want to be my lowest owned just based on skill set. And that is how it's playing out for me as well. And then you get into the secondary guys at the bottom. Max Meyer showing up 16%, Carson Fulmer showing up 12, Trevor Rogers only showed up 2. I didn't get to any Ben Lively in this build. They're all getting, I think 5 to 10% ownership, with the exception of Fulmer, who's up around 17%. Fulmer's relatively expensive at 7,300. He's not very good. Limited sample in the majors so far this year, but this is somebody that's been around for years. Former highly regarded prospect with, I want to say, the White Sox, that has never really worked out. Limited sample this year. He has struck out 22.5% of hitters, but if I remember correctly, that was basically like one game where he just went nuts. He's walked about 12% of hitters. The matchup against the Rockies is pretty close to as good as you can get. I just don't really love the ownership at this salary. It's kind of like I was saying about Lugo. Fulmer's not a $7,300 pitcher based on talent. He's a $7,300 pitcher because he's facing the Rockies, but the field is adjusting. So the ownership is already there. So I like how this worked out for me, where Max Meyer is projected for around half the ownership, give or take, of Fulmer at the same price. And I actually got a bit more Meyer. Meyer's matchup against Atlanta is more difficult than Fulmer's against Colorado. But this Atlanta team does still have strikeouts in their lineup. They are still not the best offense. Their active roster is tied for second in K percentage against right-handed pitching this year. They have a 94 WRC plus. They went out, they got Jorge Soler. That adds power to their lineup, but that's still Ks that are possible for Max Meyer. He has about a 27% K percentage at AAA this year. The stuff is there. He threw 86 pitches last start. The Marlin said he's not going to be limited going forward for the rest of the season. So I'm not saying any of that is I'm confident in Meyer, but to me, there's no reason that Max Meyer should be like half the ownership of Carson Fulmer at the same price. So I do like that I am getting a little bit more Meyer than Fulmer at that price point. Rogers, not a good strikeout pitcher, not a good strikeout matchup. He's not getting much ownership in that price range either. If you wanted to just say, well, I want Trevor Rogers instead of Max Meyer, you'd be doing basically the same thing ownership-wise. Meyer just looks a little bit better for me from a strikeout standpoint. Rogers' velocity is down this year. The strikeouts haven't been there. The Guardians are very difficult to strike out, whereas Meyer at least has the stuff to get Ks. He's got a favorable strikeout matchup, even if it is also dangerous. So I do like how that's playing out down at the bottom. But the pitchers that I'm prioritizing are the ones that I pretty much expected to. The two best strikeout pitchers on the slate, Feltner, in my opinion, the best value pitcher, and Morton just in a really good spot. Before I get on to stacks, just scrolling back to try and catch up on some of these questions. How do I like Trevor Rogers? I don't know if that's the pitcher, if you're asking about the pitcher specifically, just as a pitcher or in the spot. The answer is I don't really like him much as a pitcher, and I really don't like him against the Guardians. Just a very tough strikeout spot. Like I said, not really getting to him, but there's also not a huge difference between like him and Max Meyer for me. If you said you wanted to get to Meyer, I think that's fine. I just think Meyer's range of outcomes is a little bit better because of the strikeouts. You can actually see, those aren't my projections. I have Meyer a little bit ahead of Rogers, Fulmer ahead of both, but again, getting way more ownership. What do I think about the end of the Atlanta lineup, like 8-9-1 for a 3 stack? I mean, that's obviously not my favorite thing to do, but it is only a 5-game slate, so it happens. Kelnick, Merrifield, Soler would be the questions there. It could be worse for, an 8-9 stack. Like Kelnick at least does give you some stolen base upside. He does have some power. Merrifield, same thing, sort of. And then Soler obviously does give you power. So I think that's fine. There's, again, you're sacrificing at bats by getting to them, but at least there is some upside. They can run. You're not talking about, some catcher that has like a sub 100 ISO and you're putting him in there and just hoping that he like singles 3 times with guys on base. As far as bottom of the order stacks go, has a decent amount of upside. Montero looks pretty interesting because I think naturally Feltner will be everyone's pick as the cheapie. Yeah, like you can see, I'm getting over the field on Montero. I do also like Feltner quite a bit, though. I haven't looked at what stacks I'm getting to. I wouldn't be surprised if this is another slate where, like, I'm playing a lot of Feltner, but then where I don't have him, I have a lot of the Angels because it is a good hitter's park. This morning, I sort of compared it to the Griffin Canning spot from 2 days ago, where I think Canning was my highest owned pitcher, but then the Rockies were one of my highest owned stacks against him. Feltner, I think, is a more talented pitcher than Canning, but as far as just the way everything works out, where the Angels are cheap, the park is good, Feltner is cheap, Feltner's not bad. It's kind of the same thing where there's a really good chance that good value plays are coming from some combination of those two spots. So I haven't looked at what stacks yet. That's going to be a surprise to me also, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's, I'm getting the 42% Feltner and then a large percentage of the non-Feltner lineups are some combination of Angels. Opinion on Fulmer for FanDuel. I haven't looked at anything for FanDuel, so I don't really have one. Other than you probably don't need him on this slate. You said he's 6,700, which is the cheapest on the slate. Like, if you have some team that you have every hitter you want from both of your stacks and Fulmer's the only pitcher that fits, then, fine. Like, it's a good matchup. Where you're only rostering one pitcher and you have Gray, Imanaga, Morton, Lugo as options, I have a hard time wanting to get the Fulmer. Also, keep in mind that Lugo is just a bit better of a pitcher on FanDuel with their scoring, since you do get bonus points for the quality start. That makes strikeouts a little bit less important than on DraftKings, where you don't get the quality start bonus. Wins are only 4 points. You can get 10 points from a pitcher on FanDuel just because he goes 6 innings, gives up 3 runs or less, and gets a win. That's a pretty likely outcome for Lugo here that can make him look good with or without piling up strikeouts. That doesn't exist quite as much on DraftKings. Einsteinium said, shouldn't the gap between him, I think that was Feltner, and Montero be closer due to the park? The park's factored in. I have Feltner by 2.5 points, but also when you consider the range of outcomes for them. So like the median projection on Feltner, I have about 2.5 points higher. That is matchup based. It includes the park. It's talent based, all of that. But also a nice thing about using Sims, a big difference between using Sims and an optimizer is that you are able to also factor in range of outcomes easier, where somebody like Feltner is in a better strikeout matchup and has better strikeout stuff than Montero. So like, it's, even if Montero has a good game from a run prevention standpoint, there's going to be a nice chunk of games where he's solid for his salary, but he doesn't really do a ton for you because he didn't get a lot of strikeouts in a tough spot against KC. Whereas I think a higher percentage of the good Feltner games also come with strikeouts because of his strikeout ability compared to Montero, and also the matchup against the Angels. So I think that's the difference is, one kind of just a little bit better. I don't know how to phrase that, but better right tail when it comes to Feltner's distribution. And then also he just projects better as well. The park is different, but like the matchup for Montero is significantly worse from a strikeout standpoint and any standpoint compared to Feltner. Lugo looks extremely overowned. Yeah, I agree. I've been on that hill basically all season long. Thoughts on weather on this slate? Keep an eye on it for the next hour and a half, whatever it is till lock. There's rain in 4 of the 5 games. That's about all I can tell you. Like, it's summer. There's going to be storms that pop up. Hopefully we get some more clarity in the next hour or so. So I think I'm caught up now, or not, but I'll catch up to some more stuff later. Now moving to the top stacks, I do want to look at those before I get into position by position, because that generally is going to explain or help explain why I'm getting some players that I am. And 5-game slates are ugly. Miami showing up as the most frequently used stack for me. That is disgusting, going up against Charlie Morton. It is a park upgrade for them. They are really cheap. I did mention this morning that I thought they were going to show up for me just because Morton is popular, and you can build really good lineups around Miami. So it's not that Miami is likely to come through. It's that when they do, you're just going to have studs everywhere else in your lineup around them. So I also hopefully am getting them mostly as mini stacks. That would be cool. Yeah. So they're my highest owned 3-man. They're my highest owned 2-man. They are pretty far down the list in 5-mans. I have a few 4-mans, but the majority of these Miami stacks are mini stacks, which I certainly like more. Keith Faith just said Berger Edwards in chat. Exactly. Something like that. They're not the most exciting players, but I can 5-man stack a more expensive team like the Orioles or like the Guardians or whoever you want to get to. And then the Marlins kind of just fill in, whether that's, Jesus Sanchez or Berger or Edwards. Edwards leading off, Berger second, Sanchez third. Kyle Stowers hitting fifth has some power. So they suck and they're in a bad matchup, but it is a park upgrade and they're just going to fit into some lineups and save you some ownership as well, in addition to being cheap. Has the Angels lineup actually come out, or are we just? Oh, it did come out. Okay, cool. Yeah, Stefanich hitting second. I saw that posted in chat. Yeah, Rengifo was questionable. He is not in the lineup, so that is a bump for Feltner. Also, Feltner's not good at controlling the running game. So in addition to Rengifo being one of the better hitters on the Angels, that does take a stolen base threat out also. So when I ran all this, Rengifo was in the projected lineup I had. It is a better matchup now for Feltner with Stefanich in there hitting second, not the best version of the Angels lineup. So appreciate that being pointed out in chat. I was kind of skimming through, but saw that a couple of times. KC showing up a lot for me. That's not surprising. They're going to be one of the more popular stacks. They look good. It's just a matter of finding ways to work around their ownership. Bobby Witt Jr., Salvador Perez are going to pull that stack up in general because of the positions they play, in addition to their talent level. We have Michael Garcia leading off, so that's a lineup bump for him as well. Gives you some stolen base upside, even though he can't really hit for shit. Atlanta, St. Louis, Baltimore, Colorado, Cleveland, Detroit, all just showing up in a very similar range for me. You can add the Cubs and the Angels to that as well. I am surprised I'm not getting to the Angels more, given that they are in a good park. But I said earlier, I thought maybe I'd be getting there. I'm not. Miami appears to be the team that I'm getting to the most. Well, obviously the team I'm getting to the most, but when it comes to negatively correlated teams like Detroit, Miami, the Angels would probably, they're like the, not very good offenses that you could make the case for because the opposing pitcher is getting a lot of ownership. Miami seems to be the one I'm preferring there. Then I'm getting to, actual solid offenses, KC, Atlanta, Baltimore. The Cardinals do obviously have a tough matchup against Imanaga. They do have power right-handed hitters. They are affordably priced for most of the lineup. Colorado going up against Fulmer. I like that, given the ownership that Fulmer's getting. Colorado, obviously not exciting, but I do like getting there. Cleveland, probably going to be pretty popular, I think. So I'm assuming, and I'll see as I go position by position, that I am under the field on them. They have an okay matchup. Rogers is a very mediocre pitcher. This park's been good for home runs, but depending where their ownership is, that might be the reason that I'm not getting more of them and that they're kind of just lumped in with all these other teams. They are pretty expensive as well. Tigers showing up down here towards the bottom with the Cubs and the Angels. Do I like the Tigers for single entry? Not particularly. Like, they're one of the lowest probability teams on the board. If you are going there, so I don't want to say like definitively I don't like them, because I have been playing more single entry, more small field lately, and I do negatively correlate with popular pitching a pretty good amount. So it could be the Tigers I get to based on how this looks in large field. I assume Miami is going to be that team for me if I really go off the board with a stack. I don't like the park for the Tigers. And the other thing too, a lot of times, and you can't always control for this, but at least in theory and the way I think about it, if I'm going to negatively correlate, stack a low probability team against a popular pitcher, normally I want it to be, it's just like hard to phrase, but I want it to be a spot where I think the pitcher kind of has to get blown up for him not to do well. So for example, let's say Seth Lugo instead of 9,400 was 7,600 today. So obviously he'd be like, 70% owned. He'd be the best pitching play on the slate. But at that price, Lugo would like actually have to give up 5, 6, 7 runs for him to be a bad play that hurts your lineup. At 9,400, and if he does that, so basically what I'm saying is then if Lugo's not in your lineup, you better be hoping he's giving up 5, 6, 7 runs. And so at that point, you may as well be playing the Tigers. At 9,400, there's a window, there's a pretty nice range where Lugo just gives up like 3 runs. The Tigers are basically useless, especially in the park where they're not going to hit a lot of home runs. And Lugo still loses out to some combination of Gray, Imanaga, Morton, cheaper pitchers. So that's the other thing too. And again, that's not always actionable, but in my head, like I would, when I am negatively correlating with a pitcher, just stacking against a good pitcher that, with a weak team, one, I want them to be in a park where they're actually likely to hit home runs. Miami in Atlanta, either of these teams in Anaheim. But also I prefer doing it against pitchers that are like underpriced because it just makes the range of outcomes more polarized. Whereas when you have a pitcher that is in a good spot like Lugo, but also just overpriced from a strikeout standpoint, his range of outcomes isn't really polarized. Like he's going to have some really good games, he'll have some really bad games, as anybody will. But there's just like this window in the middle where he's just mediocre and the team against him is mediocre and nobody wins. Whereas if he's really underpriced, he's probably either just destroying that salary or the other team is doing really well because the other team actually like has to do well for him not to outperform his salary, if that makes sense. So that is one kind of reason I think that I would prefer, like Miami over the Tigers. So now we can look individually, position by position, trying to catch up on questions too. I think I got them. Salvador Perez, my highest owned catcher. That isn't surprising at all. Solid matchup against Detroit. Obviously one of the better hitting catchers in baseball. Clearly one of the best hitting catchers on the slate. Limited sample for Montero this year, but he has allowed a 281 expected ISO to righties also. He's actually held lefties to a 118 expected ISO. Again, small sample. I don't want to read into that too much, but certainly doesn't make me feel any worse about Salvador Perez. Logan O'Hoppe, I think, looks pretty good here. I'm getting to him right around the field at 14%. He is a good enough hitting catcher. He's affordable at 4,100 in non-Feltner lineups. I think even if you're not stacking the Angels, just using O'Hoppe as a one-off makes some sense. He can actually run for a catcher too. So he does have some stolen base upside. I think I alluded to it a minute ago when talking about Rengifo, but Feltner grades out pretty poorly as far as stolen bases go. The two pitchers on this slate that really grade out as one extreme or the other for me. Imanaga, very good so far at holding runners. Feltner, extremely not good. Rogers, Lively, Gray, Morton, all a bit below average. Lugo's above average, but Imanaga looks like the best. Feltner looks like the worst. So that's another point in O'Hoppe's favor. You have a dirt cheap catcher batting sixth and Dylan Dingler. Again, negatively correlates with Lugo. So this is a spot too where maybe I'm not going to 2, 3, 4-man stack the Tigers because overall they suck and they're in a park that sucks. But why not just grab the catcher in a pretty good lineup spot at a cheap price tag, punt the position and move on? Catcher's always a tough position to fill anyway. Today's no exception when you only have 10 games to choose from. Getting over the field on Wilson Contreras, which I like. He is probably driving some of those Cardinal stacks that I was getting to. Imanaga does give up a bit of power. He's a very good pitcher. He's not, going to give up tons of home runs on average or anything like that, but he has allowed a 174 expected ISO to righties this year. Contreras does have power upside. Rutschman, I'm right around the field. I am a little concerned on him, but there's not a lot I can do about it. He injured his hand a little over a month ago and has 3 extra base hits and about 100 plate appearances since then. No idea when he's going to feel better. If he's feeling better, like that's not something that's going to get announced. Maybe we'll get something where like he goes on a little bit of a hot streak and then either he or the O's manager mentions that he'd been banged up. But I think he pretty clearly has been hurt. He has like a 44 WRC plus in those 23 games. But you still kind of just have to treat him like Adley Rutschman, I think, because he's not going to tell you ahead of time probably when he's feeling better. But that is some concern. Like if you're playing one lineup or something and you just needed a tiebreaker where you don't know, you don't have a strong opinion, I think you can use that as a tiebreaker that Rutschman is pretty likely playing through an injury here. Then just kind of getting to a little bit of the rest of the catchers, 5-game slate: David Fry, Fermin, Pagas, Diaz, Murphy. Nothing that really stands out there other than I am below the field on Murphy. I am below the field on Fermin. I want to check the Kansas City lineup. So Freddie Fermin is DHing. He is getting the start against a righty. So there's not as much pinch hit risk as if he were facing a lefty since he is getting that start anyway. But the fact he's DHing does increase the risk. If he were catching, then it's a lot more difficult to swap him out. Whereas now you look at this lineup where, like, for example, you don't have MJ Melendez in it. And let's say Freddie Fermin's up in a big situation in the 6th inning with a right-handed pitcher on the mound, it pretty easily can become MJ Melendez since there's no defensive ramifications. So that is a knock against him. And then also, obviously just not the best power hitter or anything like that. Sean Murphy getting a bunch of ownership because he's cheap. He is a good value option, does have a decent matchup against Meyer, but I just don't think there's a big difference between like the range of outcomes from Murphy and somebody like O'Hoppe, who's a little bit more expensive, or Dingler, who's cheaper. It's still, there's so much variance in one game, and it's not like Murphy is some stud hitter or anything like that. And it's not like he's facing a total gas can in Meyer either. Unproven major league pitcher for sure, has dealt with a lot of injuries, but highly regarded prospect, former 3rd overall pick, does have good stuff. It's not like he's out there facing, some total gas can. Moving over to first base, Salvador Perez showing up 10% there. So combined, I think that's like 26% Perez. So I'm around 2x the field on him overall. Michael Toglia showing up for me. I don't know if we have a Rockies lineup yet. So yeah, so he's batting 6th. So we didn't have that lineup when I ran all of this, but he is batting 6th. So he's still going to look pretty good there. Going up against Fulmer, who, again, just not a particularly good pitcher. Limited sample this year, has a lot of 244 expected ISO to lefties. This park will play up left-handed power as well. 228 in a little bit bigger sample since last year. Not much of a sample really over the last few years because he's just not been in the majors. 205 going back to 2021 is the expected ISO against left-handed hitters. So Toglia just looks pretty good at 4K. Jake Berger getting 15% ownership. I'm at 14%. Ideally, he'd be getting less ownership just because like he is facing Charlie Morton, and that matchup isn't great. But Morton does give up power to righties at times. 167 expected ISO this season, 177 going back to last year. And Berger is cheap for the amount of power that he has. Vinny Pasquantino, Perez, obviously mentioned. Matt Olson, getting double-digit ownership. I'm right around the field on those guys. They all just look pretty good. Ryan O'Hearn, I'm around the field there too. 4,300. Pretty good matchup against Ben Lively. Doesn't miss a lot of bats. This park is playing up left-handed power in particular drastically this year. 163 expected ISO to left-handed hitters for Lively. So not terrible, but not lights out either. Not taking any huge stands outside of Toglia, I guess, right now at first base as far as guys that I am getting to. As far as guys that I'm not, I'm pretty far below the field on Nolan Schanuel. I am pretty far below the field on Jankowski Noel. Noel has a lot of power. He's got a pretty good matchup against Rogers, who doesn't miss a lot of bats against righties. I do have concerns about him being pinch hit for. He is getting the start in right field, which, as I was just saying with Freddie Fermin, is better than if you were starting at DH, but you can still sub in, left-handed hitters for him later in the game. So there is some pinch hit risk. There is legitimate home run upside too. I understand why he's getting ownership from a value standpoint. I just am not getting to the Guardians as much as the field, as I kind of already mentioned, I don't think. And then also there is that pinch hit risk there. Could also be getting to him a bit more in the outfield. I guess I could check that right now because of the way that this differentiates positions. But yeah, it doesn't look like I'm really getting much of him. Yeah, 2% in the outfield. So I am under the field on him. And I think it's probably just a combination of I'm using Feltner a lot, so I don't need to pay down for these popular value bats as often. I'm not getting to the Guardians as a stat quite as much as the field. Pinch hit risk being factored in. So it's scary not to be there, but that makes sense. For Schanuel, he's getting a bunch of ownership. He is a good price tag. He's been hitting really well lately. Matchup against Feltner isn't good, but it's not terrible either. Lefties this year, 175. Expected ISO against him with about a 20% strikeout percentage. So I think it's probably just an ownership thing there where, one, I am prioritizing Feltner, and then two, the ownership is just already on Schanuel, and so I'm getting to some other guys. $3,900 for Michael Busch, getting there instead if he's actually in the lineup. Didn't have a Cubs lineup when I ran this either. Looks like we still don't. But just examples like that. You can find other first basemen that are decent. So nothing that really stands out too much at first base other than not getting to those two guys, and I'm getting to Toglia. At second base, my God, that is an insane amount of Otto Lopez. Wouldn't be upset if that changed, but also second base sucks today, especially like Renjifo's not in. So you turn Renjifo into Michael Stefanich, and it gets even worse. Otto Lopez against Morton, it's really nothing other than he negatively correlates with a popular pitcher. He's cheap. He's got a reasonable spot in the batting order. He can run a bit. He has 8 stolen bases this year in a relatively limited time. Morton's not that good at holding runners. He's also not popular. Like when you get a weak position like this, I am going to be running away from ownership a lot more often than, for example, I haven't looked at shortstop yet, but I assume I'm just playing a bunch of popular Bobby Witt or at catcher. Like I was playing a bunch of popular Perez and getting to Rutschman and all of that. Those guys are like legitimately good and stand out at their positions. At second base, none of these guys stand out. And so you can't tell me that Otto Lopez, even in a tough matchup, is twice as bad as Brendan Rodgers or Whit Merrifield, or 3 times as bad as Michael Garcia, even in a decent matchup. So for that reason, I don't mind that he's showing up a lot, but also like that's a lot of Otto Lopez. Hopefully he just steals some bases for me. Michael Massey looking pretty good. He dropped down in the order, so he is batting 6th now instead of leadoff. That does make the price tag a little bit less palatable, but also lowers the ownership a bit. He might get a little bit more ownership now that Rengifo's not in the lineup. Like this 15% ownership has to go somewhere, and it's probably not going to Michael Stefanich. Stefanich will get some because he's hitting second, but I don't think he's going to be 15, 20% owned or anything. Maybe Michael Garcia gets a little bit more also. Not getting to as much Garcia as the field, at least at second base. I might be at third. Not getting to a ton of Drury. So this, I think, does explain why I'm not getting to those Angel stacks. Like I said before, that I was a little surprised that I wasn't, and that I was expecting to get to them against Feltner. But if the field is just going to be pretty aggressively getting to the Angels, one, that explains another reason that I'm getting the Feltner. And then 2, it explains why I'm not getting to the Angels. So yeah, Otto Lopez day at second base, I guess, for me. Third base, now we're back to getting to some actual good hitters. Jose Ramirez showing up a lot. I like him here at 6K. Trevor Rogers, like I said before, doesn't miss a lot of bats against righties. Jose Ramirez tends to hit the ball harder from the right side, which is nice. So he is popular, but I'm getting more than the field. We already talked about Jake Berger, but I'm getting a lot of him. I was around the field at first base at 14%, tacking on another 20. So I'm just getting a lot of Jake Berger, which isn't too surprising given the number of Miami mini stacks I was getting. Berger would obviously be one of my preferred options in any Miami mini stack. Austin Riley right around the field on him, going up against Meyer. No issues with that. I like being around 2x the field here on Arenado. Just a fairly priced right-handed bat against Imanaga. So you're getting some negative correlation. Arenado obviously has a track record of being a good hitter. Not a good matchup, but I do like the price tag. I like the spot in the order, all of that. Nothing else standing out too much at third base. I am a little bit under the field on McMahon, around half the field. That surprises me a little bit just because I do generally like playing Ryan McMahon. I generally play a pretty good amount. It is a good park for left-handed power, but I'm just getting to some other third basemen. I'm not getting to 13% Ramon Urias. Again, kind of the theme of this show, I think, going through the hitters is that if you are a cheap hitter that is projected for a lot of ownership, I'm not really getting to you. I'm just mixing in other guys. And this goes back to, the Otto Lopez example, obviously a different position, but he's not worse than Ramon Urias. He's in a worse matchup. He's on a worse offense, but range of outcomes wise, they're pretty close to the same. Jonah Bride is an example here. He's batting cleanup for Miami. Urias is batting 8th for Baltimore. Bride's actually $100 less expensive. He's getting half the ownership. This is not a Jonah Bride endorsement. It's just why not spread out your exposures across these guys? Unless you're just stacking a ton of Baltimore. Then obviously you should be mixing in Urias as well. But I didn't have tons and tons of Baltimore. At shortstop, Bobby Witt at the top as expected. 36% of the lineups I'd be playing have Bobby Witt. It's Bobby Witt. I don't really have a whole lot else to say. Same goes for Gunnar Henderson. He's projected for 12% ownership. I'm getting to 22. This is also another Ryan Feltner point. If Ramon Urias, and again, it's not gospel, like Henderson might end up being more popular than Urias, but just for the sake of the ownership projections right now, Urias getting a little bit more than Henderson. Obviously, it's a price thing, but if I can just play Ryan Feltner, who I think is perfectly fine, and then that allows me to get more Gunnar Henderson and less Ramon Urias, that's a spot that I like being. Around the field on Arcia at shortstop, he did get a nice lineup bump. He's hitting 5th. He's 2,800. So that is one of the popular value plays I am actually getting to. I'm a little over the field on Xavier Edwards. I'm around half the field on Ezekiel Tovar. So, Again, just seemingly not really getting to the Rockies too much, at least their popular ones. I was getting to a lot of Toglia against Fulmer. Yeah, like I think Tovar is a fine play, good point per dollar play, all of that. I'm just heavily prioritizing Witt and Gunnar as two of just the highest upside plays on the entire slate, regardless of position. And then in the outfield, Jesus Sanchez, no surprise given the amount of the other Miami guys I'm getting to. He's showing up a lot, 3,400, batting third. It's just a value bat that is getting some ownership, but not a ton. Jorge Soler showing up for me at 4,500. Leading off, I think that's a pretty good play. Renfroe, I'm around the field. I'm over the field on Ian Happ against Gray. So I think that's the first Cubs bat that I've actually mentioned having a decent amount of. 4,200. Gray is a good pitcher, doesn't give up a lot of power, but I don't mind it at low ownership. Ozuna, pretty close to the field. Cowser, pretty close to the field. That 4K price tag on Cowser really stands out here. He's gotten a lineup bump recently to the leadoff spot. He's been hitting really well lately. He also changed bats. I think yesterday, he went from like a 33.5 ounce bat to 34. He said that it just slows his bat down in the zone a little bit, which is something that he was having an issue with. He's been hitting a lot better since the change. And then you get this park where lefties have just been crushing home runs all season long. So again, I think one of the better value plays, if we want to call 4K value, that stands out. I like getting there. Using Tommy Pham a bit, another right-handed bat. Not going to call him a power bat, but a right-handed bat that at least has some home run potential against Imanaga. Santander, good spot for him against his former organization. Lane Thomas, good spot for him against Rogers. So pretty much around the field on a lot of these guys in here. Over the field on Suzuki against Gray. So again, kind of just targeting this game, I think, where I'm not going crazy, the Cubs and Cardinals game, not going crazy as far as the exposure that I'm getting, but you do have a 34% owned pitcher and a 26% owned pitcher in that game, and basically no ownership coming into the offenses. It is just when you think, take a step back and get out of the habit of thinking about what's going to happen and think about more like, how easy is it for me to get paid off if this goes well? Pretty nice like path of least resistance to be getting some bats in this game, and just hoping you get the a bad start from one of those guys. Tyler Freeman, I think, is really interesting here. He's getting like half the ownership of Noel at $100 less, batting one spot behind him in the order. He don't have the same type of power, but still it's a hitter in a baseball game. Tyler Freeman also good defensively, so you don't have the same sort of pinch hit risk, although he is playing second base. So, actually, I'm going to take that back. He does have pinch hit risk. Jimenez could very easily end up being Freeman if he were in the outfield. So, like Lane Thomas, I don't really think has pinch hit risk. Freeman actually does pretty significantly. But again, so does Noel. So, I think at the very least, that's just an interesting kind of ownership spot amongst right-handed Cleveland bats. Getting around half the field on Taylor Ward, around half the field on Bryant. That's kind of been the trend on that game offensively. Cedric Mullins getting ownership. I'm not really there at 3,600. I don't think there's a specific reason for that. Mullins doesn't have the most power, but he does give you stolen base upside. So I think Mullins is a fine value play. It probably is just I end up prioritizing Cowser, Santander, Henderson for obvious reasons. And at some point I have to stop just rostering popular Orioles. So that's probably the reason I'm not really getting to as much Mullins. Kevin Hull said weather in Cleveland not looking good. Yeah, weather. I mean, there's weather issues. I mentioned it earlier. There's weather issues everywhere, except for the Angels game. So something that you just have to keep an eye on as you get closer to lock. Not getting to much Noel. I already talked about that. Not getting to much Mickey Moniak if he's in the lineup. He is batting sixth, so he's one spot higher than he was projected. But, again, just kind of seems like I'm not getting to a lot of the Angels or Rockies compared to ownership. Not really getting to the Guardians too much outside of Jose Ramirez as far as teams go. So to recap and hit on some questions, any questions that people have left in chat. Feltner, right now, if the slate started, would be my highest owned pitcher. That could come down a bit if ownership projections adjust, but I do like just the value component. He looks good. And then also the Angels are projected to be pretty popular. And so you are getting some negative correlation there as well. Imanaga, Gray, Morton, I think all look good. Lugo likely to be a pitcher that I'm under the field on just because of a lack of strikeout stuff. Montero, from a value standpoint, looks fine. I would be over the field on him, although I do still like Feltner better as far as value goes. But the combination here of 42%, 60% of my lineups having either Feltner or Montero is why I'm able to get over the field on Gunnar, over the field on Witt, over the field on Perez, and similarly under the field on a lot of questionable value. And then the other spot that I thought was interesting, not that it's a priority, but potentially pivoting off of this Carson Fulmer ownership. The range of outcomes for Fulmer is just simply not twice as good as Meyer or even Rodgers. I prefer Meyer because the strikeout stuff is much better than Rodgers and the strikeout matchup is much better than Rodgers. So Meyer would be my preferred guy to pivot some of this Fulmer ownership to. But if you just, though, you're playing Atlanta, you hate Max Meyer, whatever it may be, Trevor Rodgers is the same kind of thing. Like Carson Fulmer is not a good pitcher. He just happens to be in a good matchup. So I do think the ownership here in this like trio, and you can even throw Ben Lively in here at 8K, even though I don't have him, but in this group is pretty interesting. And I like, I'm happy to see that I'd be spreading it out a little bit, particularly playing Meyer over Fulmer. So that's all I have. Thanks for checking out the show. Don't forget to hit the thumbs up button. Subscribe to Endgame Syndicate using the link in the description below. Nerdy Tenor has a new best ball toy game series out, breaking down some best ball approaches and how you should be attacking that game in some specific instances. So if you are getting into best ball now with about a month to go to the season, be sure to check that out. Subscribe to the channel, all that stuff. And I'll be back here tomorrow morning for the First Look morning show, and then back here again for the same show tomorrow. Thanks again. Good luck on the slate. Have a good rest of your Thursday.